All right.
Hi, I'm Dr. Cindy Dupuy. I have a PhD in learning disabilities. I do diagnostic assessment, intervention, and advocacy. I'm also an adult with dyslexia and dysgraphia.
Hi, my name is Kim Sharman. I'm a reading and writing remediation specialist, and I work with kids with dyslexia, dysgraphia, and ADHD, and I too have ADHD.
Hi, my name is Tiffany, and I work with kids with dyslexia, dysgraphia, and ADHD, and I'm also an adult with ADHD.
All right, so the question came up. Tiff, ask your question.
What's the difference between like scaled or standard testing scores and testing?
Okay,
So generally.
so this is a really common question. Why is there a scaled score and why is there a standard score?
Hmm.
So a scaled score is on a metric of 10, and not to get too technical, it has a standard deviation of 3. A
Got
standard
it.
score is on a metric of 100, and it has a
Mhm.
standard deviation of 15. For those of you that are technical and want to look that up, great. Oftentimes, the way that they calculate a standard score, especially on an IQ test, is they average a group of scale scores to come up with a standard score. So let's take a look. I've pulled up a profile that we've looked at previously on here, but this is a good comparison. So you'll notice here, and you can convert any scale score to a standard score. So for example, the 17 is a 135, this 18 is a 140, right? And so if you were, you would look at that and say, okay, so 135, 140, how do you get up with a 142? And the answer is it is relatively uncommon to score that high on both subtests. And so when they norm the test, when they go out and they sample from all the people and they look at it, the rate of people scoring that high using statistical analysis is relatively uncommon. And that actually boosts your score up higher. Okay.
Mm.
Now let's go look at something in the average range. How did I know I would pull one that's this beautiful? So this would
Not
be,
a real person, by the way, Cup Jones.
it's not a real person. It's a profile that we have looked, that I have taken from another individual. We've modified the numbers and the data. So it's not a real person anymore. But so if you'll notice, if you were to theoretically average those two, it would be about a 103. It's fairly common to have those two that close, so you end up with a 102. So they
Hmm.
combine both of those scores and look at the frequency that those two scores occur together, and they, to some degree, average them, but it falls in that range. Does that
Right.
kind of make sense?
That makes sense.
So if you were going to look at, for example, the C-top, they have an index score that is the average of elision, blending, sounds, and phoneme isolation. So three of them combine to make your phonemic awareness. So they essentially average those three and say, how frequently does the score profile, those occur together? What is the rough average of those? And then they come up
Mm.
with that score. So you sum
Got
them
it.
up and then you go to another specific table and you can look it up. Does that
Got it.
kind of make sense?
Hmm.
So you as a parent, when you're looking at it, you want to think about why a student's score profile might look the way that it does, in terms of, are the scores consistent with one another, or do they seem to be really um, out of line and uncommon? And I happen to have pulled up another one really quick that we can take a quick look at, um, where we have something kind of unusual going on in the score profile. So let's pull this one up for a second. So Tiff, there should be one that jumps out at you. Well, there may be two or three that jump out at you when you look at this. And this is a WAIS on somebody.
Oh, the first one would definitely be the block design, I would
Yep.
say. Would you say that?
Yep.
That's a huge number difference, is what I'm seeing. And then if I can guess, there's a couple, but processing speed would be the next one.
Yep.
And then I would say work. It's hard between working memory and verbal comprehension, but is that correct for
Yeah,
that
yeah,
general
100%
analysis?
spot on. So, Kim,
Okay.
when you see a profile like this, what do you think?
I say, wow, this kid's really bright and something's going on here.
That is a great Kim answer. That's a beautiful Kim
Mm-hmm.
answer. Now, I did something unusual in here, and I don't do this often. This is a
Mm-hmm.
clinical judgment case. So, a normal perceptual reasoning includes block design, matrix reasoning, and visual puzzles. That is the
Okay.
standard calculation for perceptual reasoning. I chose to administer figure weights because I did not believe that the student's performance on the block design subtest was an accurate representation of his abilities, but rather was reflecting his learning difference. And so I made the decision to do a substitution in part because of the statistics of it. So having a 7 point difference between figure weights and block design is
Mm.
statistically significant and clinically unusual.
Usual.
Okay. And then notice that those three clump together beautifully, like they're
Mm-hmm.
all within a couple of points of each other, and it kind of makes sense as a cluster. Now, this is the old WAIS, the new WAIS is out, and that's the one that I'm using now. But the other one that stands out is here with the information subtest.
Oh, mm,
Okay, Tiffany, the information subtest is your factual knowledge of what's
Wow.
going on in the world. So they ask questions
Okay.
around major figures in history,
Mm.
geography, scientific principles, those kinds of things.
Got it.
And the student could do very well on the more open-ended, where you could talk your way through the test.
Mm-hmm.
So on similarities, how are the two words alike? Vocabulary, define the word. Information, you have to be able to pull the correct specific label. And if you can't
Mm-hmm.
pull the target name of the character or individual,
Yeah.
you can't get credit.
That's so hard too. In general, I feel like.
Right? So if I ask the
Mm-hmm.
question, who was the first president of the United States?
It would take them a little while to kind
Or
of
they wouldn't
pull it.
come up with George Washington.
I see.
I would get
Even if they have
Abraham
learned
Lincoln.
it.
I would get,
Mm-hmm.
other common historical names that come to mind first for whatever reason, and they wouldn't be able to recall or pull the specific one. By the way, that is not on the test. If anybody wants to study that, I'm very good at that.
I have
um,
a quick question. Oh,
sure.
so this goes into the perception reasoning, but when you said about the block design and you kind of substitute it for the figure weights, did you initially do that prior to seeing the test score discrepancies? Is that the right way to go about it? Or did you add it on because you saw in general studies that there was, not as reflective with
Um,
the students?
so I score after I score sometimes in the real moment.
Okay,
Um, so I'm doing a running total as I administer because it's more efficient and it gives me a sense of where we're going. But when
got
I
it.
watch this individual complete block design, their inability to build a four block configuration when it was rotated was like, whoa! Like the kid
Mm,
kept trying to square it and do all these really interesting things. And I'm like, something wacky is going on here. I'm really
mm-hmm.
curious about taking the picture and mentally parsing it versus seeing the target and can you select three to go together. So the
Right.
clinician in me is dynamically assessing what's going on here and I want to better understand it. If I give you a process
Mm-hmm.
of elimination, can you put them together in your head versus can you physically manipulate it? And so I was going to administer it no matter what. And then when I was
Mm-hmm.
actually scoring it and looking at the statistics of it, I made the decision
Right.
to make the substitution.
because
That's
this
amazing.
was so errant or whatever the word is out of the realm of the other two. You this is the dynamic part of your testing.
Yes,
You make the decision
Mm-hmm.
in the moment.
right. When I do dynamic assessment, I'm thinking about what kinds of errors am I seeing and why, and what does that mean to me? This is part of the reason that I dug into doing some more visual spatial tests and looking more deeply at this individual's math,
Mm-hmm.
because block design, visual puzzles, matrix reasoning are all right
Right.
hemisphere and are related to math in pattern
Mm-hmm.
recognition, understanding quantity. Figure weights builds into that as well. Can you think and reason mathematically? And what's really interesting about this particular individual is he has memorized very clearly how to do computations, but
Mm-hmm.
when we ask him to think and reason mathematically without being able to rely on algorithms, can
Right.
you skip count by 11? Can
Mhm.
you backward count by -3 or whatever? Not that that one's in there, but you get the idea.
Mm-hmm.
The minute we move into that realm, he
Discrepancies.
100% struggled, right? He struggled with sequences, what comes next in the number sequence, because they're not standard. And then in the equation building, he couldn't recognize equations that he himself would not format.
Mm, got it.
So
How would
let
you say? Go ahead.
I was
No, go
just
ahead.
it's not some people say, well, isn't that cheating that you pulled out his bad score out of the IQ? It's not. What you're trying to do is make this most as accurate as possible, this IQ, but you're recognizing a learning difference there that is going to be addressed later on in the test.
Yes,
Mm,
that's very specific reason. The fact that many of the kids that are assessed for dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, often have the working memory and the processing speed scores pop out. Uh, 30 years ago, we talked about the ACID test, which is digit span coding, whatever it was at the time. It was WISC 3. Didn't
mm,
hold out, but you see this consistent pattern, which is why they came up with the general ability being a combination of those to get you a general ability index versus a full scale
mm,
IQ. And so it is, it's a process of dynamic assessment. It's not about number, it's about why the number occurred. So, yeah,
mm.
so he got a 7. Why did he get a 7? Was he a
Right.
slow processor? Could he not build it? You'll notice when I described it, I described the fact that he couldn't do the 45-degree rotation in building figures. He couldn't
Mm,
mentally parse the design to figure out how he would put it together. When I see
right.
kids flip blocks over and over and over and over again, and put it back in the exact same configuration that they had it as they go
Mm,
to another half, and then they put it back exactly the way they had it, that tells me that they can't mentally see what's happening there, and they can't adjust to accommodate what they built relative to the target. And that's that kind of dynamic assessment model. Equally, on the information subtest, I'm looking at how long does it take you to come up with an answer? Are you close? Are you
mm,
like, I know it, it's on the tip of my tongue? Or are you wildly out of the park? Are you needing
mm.
a long time to pull your response, or can you go like this because it's right there?
Is
Right.
that
It's untimed. You can take as long as you want to
Mm,
come up with your answer. However, in the instructions to clinicians, they expect you to keep up a reasonable pace in the administration of the test so that you don't fatigue the client, which I get.
yeah.
However, at that point, we also have to give the student adequate time to think if they've got issues with retrieval, processing speed, whatever. I'm also looking at, so these 3 subtests are all timed. Okay. Um,
Got it.
this one gets a bonus points for how fast you solve. These have time limits.
Mm,
Um, and if you get it right 1 second after the allowed time, doesn't matter, you get no credit.
mm. So this is a side question more so about the timing aspect. So you're saying some are time tests, some are not time tests, and then we add in an element of burnout or fatigue. So is there a general where you're seeing a trend of where that kind of, giving them the time and not having that pressure, but then the scores or how that affects? Does that question make sense?
Totally. That is
Okay,
why when a student comes in, I warm them up on something super approachable, super
gotcha.
easy, like I'm picking one of four pictures to correspond to a spoken vocabulary word, or
Mm-hmm.
I'm drawing something that doesn't feel threatening. So I get you going with something that's not horrible.
Right.
Then I step you into demanding things, and I'm reading body language. And about
Yeah.
70 to 80 minutes in, I'm saying, all right, we're taking a break. And I give them a solid 15, 20-minute break, which most
Mm,
clinicians don't do because that's a big chunk of your testing time. But I give them that break because I know the
yeah.
level of fatigue.
Yeah.
And then we'll step back in and finish the IQ test.
Got it.
I will also make the judgment call, and they tell you to do it in the manual. If the student is showing levels of fatigue, you stop and you continue at another point in time. And
Mm-hmm.
my students come in for a minimum of 2 days of testing, often three, sometimes 4 or 5, depending on what we're trying to get done.
Right.
Um, and I can break it up as long as I keep the intelligence measure. I like to keep the IQ test within 2 days, ideally
Mm-hmm.
one day after another.
Right.
But for example, on the Stanford Binet, it's untimed except for one subtest. And if a student is making adequate progress, you don't stop them.
Oh,
And the final items on the IQ test were designed by the 150s in the world. They designed the final math items.
uh-huh.
And I have students that can do them, and they get pencil and paper, and you're looking over to see if they're making progress. And if they're making progress, you got to let them work. And part of the
Wow.
reason I picked the Stanford Binet is it doesn't have the processing speed component, and it's a power versus a speed test. And I will
Mm,
frequently get kids that can score through the roof on those measures because they have the time to think and solve. And I want to show that horsepower.
right.
What percentage of the time do you do Stanford Bernays?
I'm probably down to about 20% of the time I will do a Stanford Binet. Um, maybe 15%. On younger students, if I see a processing speed issue, I will go KBC versus Stanford Binet, unless the kid, like, I go with gut instinct on it, having done it as long as I have. Um, and they both have different attributes, but the KABC offers a non-time bonus scoring, which can be to a student's benefit and it can be not to the student's benefit. And we'll talk about ceiling effects in another day, but it's it's trying to get an accurate picture of what is a student capable of. What do we need to
Yeah.
understand? And it's not necessarily about an IQ score, but what's happening learning wise that we get this really interesting profile, and what does that tell us about how they need to learn?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
No, it does.
And it's never just, so what, it's a 7. What does a 7 mean? If everything's a 7, it means that that's the average score for the student. If it's
Mm-hmm.
a 7 and everything else is a 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, something's happening there, and I as a clinician have got to be asking why.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean?
Yeah.
How does it impact? How does it affect their learning?
Mm-hmm.
And how does this drive what we do for them and why we do it?
Is it okay for a parent to ask, do you do dynamic testing and change your mind when they,
A parent can ask that. The number of clinicians out there that do dynamic assessment is rather small because tests are expensive. Learning tests is not easy. And not every clinician has the majority of their practice. My practice, 90% of my practice is assessment.
Mm.
Many psychologists who are in private practice, that is not their meat and potatoes.
Mm.
They do therapy, and so they limit their testing library.
So you can ask, but you're not going to always get the answer.
Right.
Right.
And school psychologists only have what districts will purchase for them. And they make a determination as to what they can afford to purchase within their budget. And then the district may have additional one-off tests at the headquarters that they can use as alternates, but not necessarily have it at every school.
Mm-hmm.
So it's complex.
Yeah.
I'm unique in what I do on so many different levels. Questions or comments? We'd love to hear from you. Like us. We'll see you again soon.